Hey kid. Hey, psst. You ever heard about video games? Like, have you ever heard of this video game called Doom? Doom, the first-person shooter. Before the 2016 game that came out trading on its identity, this name referred to a game that came out in 1993 and was quickly followed by a sequel named Doom 2, then by Quake, and then by Quake 2, then by Half-Life, then Half-Life Episode 2, then Half-Life Alyx. And there is a chain of history that defines the literal everyday environment of video games that is probably directly spawned from Doom. Steam, one of the dominant gaming platforms, is in part the result of people who made a mod for Quake called Team Fortress, which was one of the many children of Doom. A large body of the early architecture making remote gaming possible pre-internet that was made for Doom started out with a service called Dwango, which was so successful in Japan that it's now a major corporation that itself owns Spike Chunsoft, and is owned by Kadokawa, the company that also owns Bookwalker. Competing with and attempting to displace the genre of gameplay Doom and its children Quake created, resulted in a shareware distributor called Epic Mega Games creating the video game Unreal, and the engine named after that game now runs everything, up to and including Star Wars TV shows that I'm told are really good, but which I'm not interested in because it's Star Wars and also pay your fucking workers. Doom is so important to games that for a time, that genre of first-person shooter was known as Doom clones. Doom is important. Doom is so important, it's difficult to express how important it is. Talking about how important Doom is to gaming history is like trying to describe the importance of Franz Ferdinand to world history. Except that dude is no fun at parties, since he's dead, while by comparison, you can boot up the original Doom right now and still blast around having a great time with a game that largely holds up using a simple system of design tools that have been iterated on endlessly for over 30 years. We have never stopped playing Doom. When we talk about games being important, we tend to describe games in a way that hints at a sort of historical sequence of necessary steps. Hi Ted, I know I'm skirting close to teleology here. You know, the narrative that this game existed so this game can exist so this game can exist. Trust me, I'm not. This is not about how things had to happen. It's about reflecting back on how people say things happened. Because they've told us. In the same way that the terrible 90s real-time strategy game Crush, Kill, and Destroy directly led to the creation of Total Warhammer 3 because it sucked so bad, we know that Doom and its enormous success is what led to the gaming landscape we live in looking like does now. Doom is one of the great landmarks, one of the first touchstones, the PC gaming thing that made it relevant to gaming beyond the boundaries of the PC. With that in mind, let's not talk about Doom. Let's talk about the game franchise that made it possible for Doom to exist. Let's talk about the language of Minecraft, the formation and end of id Software's earliest identity, and an inexplicable cameo by Tom Cruise. Let's talk about Commander Keen. Kicked off in 1990, Commander Keen is a series of 6 games made and distributed with the, at the time, new shareware model of games. They're adventure stories focused on the adventures of one, gotta do this right, William Joseph Blazkowicz II. Blazkowicz. Pick one. AKA Billy Blaze. Incredibly smart with an IQ of 314, Billy is an inventor, who at the age of only 8 has been tinkering away in his backyard, even making a spaceship out of junk from around the home. For reasons that are at this point uncertain, he dons his older sister's football helmet and declares himself Commander Keen, defender of something or other, depending upon which part of the text you're reading. All we know really about Billy at this point is that he's a plucky kid, he's a boy genius, and he's gonna solve problems himself. It's Calvin and Hobbes, but the spaceship is real, and instead of a tiger, he's got a gun. Shareware was a really cool way to get games back in the day. You were given free license to distribute some, or even all, of a game as shareware, but the people who made it asked you to send them some money to register the copy, as a thank you for the program that you had. Sometimes registering software would get you more of the game or product. Doom was shareware. Wolfenstein was shareware. Almost every game distributed by Apogee and Epic Mega Games was some kind of shareware, and shareware was the way that good, easily distributed games became popular and made money enough to sustain their development. That meant that a lot of games of this time were divided up into chapters so that they could shareware the first part and then sell the rest. Such it is with Commander Keen's first 3 games, the Vorticon trilogy. First up, we have Marooned on Mars. In this story, while his parents are off having a nice dinner, Keen sneaks out and goes to Mars. As you do. He explores around a bit, and when the time comes to head home, he finds his spaceship, the Bean with Bacon mega rocket, has had 4 of its parts nicked, and now you've got to go explore the world to find them. Along the way, you encounter the aliens of Mars, which range from your friendly Yorps, one-eyed, goofy, friendly problems that run into you and push you into things, but are just trying to be nice, to the deadly Gargs, giant, 2-eyed monsters that can race at high speeds towards you and kill you. And finally, the pajama-clad Vorticons. Not Vortigaunts, they come along later, but builds on my theory that this game is part of the lineage that leads to Half-Life 3. Vorticons are a kind of dog alien that isn't from Mars with the mysterious ability that no other monster in the game has, which is jumping very high. The Vorticons are connected in some nebulous way to the plot to keep Keen stranded on Mars, which they didn't just try and do by waiting by the mega rocket and killing you, but, we take those. You thwart their plot, usually by shooting them, you drop an enormous weight on their leader, and then you make your way home. This was the shareware episode of the trilogy, so it's the one most people of the time are likely to know. It dropped in December 1990 and gave you 16 levels to peek around in. It was brightly coloured and had big, detailed, for the time, sprites. In purely technical terms, it's incredible, but not in ways that most people would ever notice. It's a real classic video game of its type, and you might be forgiven for asking, well, what's the big deal when you look at it? This is definitely a type of game that looks unremarkable to the Nintendo market at the time. It's basically a slightly higher resolution version of something like Super Mario Bros., and maybe a bit more of an exploration game than a to-the-right, hold-on-tight, plotless execution type. We got a lot of video games early on in the history of shareware that were ultimately exploration games. They drop you into a space to look around, and then they give you stuff to find that lets you win the game. A lot of them were about going to some strange, distant place, whether that's Mars or South America, and then walk off with treasure from there. This particular narrative, from a designer perspective, is really desirable because it encourages you, the player, to get involved with the place and look around for things you might want. But it's also a trend you'll see come up in a lot of conversations around colonialism in games. Yes, I'm saying Paganitsu is racist. And yes, Paganitsu goes places, but we're not talking about Paganitsu here. We're talking about Commander Keen 1, Marooned on Mars, and I will try and keep on track if it kills me. What Commander Keen does that is, instead of putting you in the shoes of a colonizer, it puts you in the shoes of an explorer who has been trapped. Keen shows up on Mars to look around, because it's cool, but his goal isn't the enrichment of the self. It isn't his own treasure and loot. It's reclaiming some Earth artifacts that the Martians seem to have stolen. Why do they have 1980s Pepsi? And the tools taken from him are to stop him from escaping. What we know about Mars's history is that there are the Yorps and the Gargs. Gargs, violent and aggressive, ruled over the Yorps for years and built a civilization on Mars. And then, in 1976, humans accidentally committed the first interplanetary act of regicide, killing the king of the Gargs by dropping the exploratory Voyager probe on him at high speed. Based. Then the civilization was fractured, and all these city-states were left to fend for themselves. and then the Vorticons show up and take over a few places. It's weird because, in a way, as much as this silly aesthetic holds together, it's doing so with an actual narrative there. In the context of trying to make a video game that just looked and felt like a Mario's Brosentia, it's kind of just video game stuff, like gigantic lollipops. But the structure it built around is a story of a colonized people at war and their attempts to ensnare a stranger in their mess. I believe this potential vision of atrocities and power and control and colonialism to be 100% entirely accidental. Alright, so moving on to the next game. Keen fixes the Bean with Bacon Mega Rocket and flies back home to Earth before his parents come home from their nice dinner. This was a thing that could happen in the 90s, it's wild. Anyway, they arrive home and check in on Billy. Finding their beloved son faking being asleep, they're about to go to bed themselves before they notice the Yorp he brought home. Rather than contend with it so late at night, his parents promise to talk about it in the morning and go to bed. Once his parents have been tucked up in bed, though, Billy sneaks out once more because now he has to deal with the huge floating battleship next to Earth that he saw on the way home. Thus begins the second game, where you now have to quest your way through a battleship, which has its guns trained on a bunch of important Earth cities and New York. If you want, you can even fire the guns, ending the game and blowing up a city you think sucks. Like the only place that apparently has bodegas. But it's the same basic energy as the first game. Find your way through levels, avoid baddies, shoot things, explore secrets, and break the right machines so you could get out and go home. In any given trilogy, you run the risk of creating a middle problem. The middle of a story doesn't usually get to do anything because the stakes are set up in the first part and resolved in the third, so a whole middle, as a game unto itself, can feel like padding. The Earth Explodes avoids that because it is still an interesting game with its own exploration mechanic to it, and a real consequence for failure, its own stakes. But the why isn't explained. It's a detour, but it's not a cul-de-sac. Also, this game has a gun? It's not Keen's first gun. His first gun is the one you pick up from the surface of Mars, not one of the things Keen makes himself. That's also where he gets the pogo stick, which was maybe some sort of alien artifact they stole from Earth a long while after ago? Sometime after 1919 when the thing was invented? Don't get bogged down in those details. The point is, the gun in Commander Keen is external to the self. He gets his first gun in the first level, and it's marked with a sign he can't read. The gun is essential to completing the game. There is a final puzzle that can't be solved without access to the gun. Also, along the way, numerous lethal threats can be contained with the gun. Enemies that are willing to kill Keen are shot and stop. Some things won't stop when shot, and some things are only annoying when they're unshot, but basically, the gun is framed as a tool for protecting Keen himself. In the mothership, you pick up your next gun, which seems largely the same as the last gun, but stronger. It can now best Vorticons in only one hit, and you're off. Keen disables the many guns of the mothership and is presented with very few opportunities for a truly pacifist run. While the nature of the game doesn't make shooting enemies absolutely 100% required, it is definitely necessary for a blind playthrough, and level design makes any alternative pretty much impossible for the play skill levels that, don't have speed-running pixel-perfect tricks. This is a game where the gun is essential for breaking the ship's plot-critical guns, as gun feeds on gun, and it is a tool for solving problems. But there is an optional level you can do where you find, after a long passage that has involved shooting more Vorticons, a frozen Vorticon. The frozen Vorticon tells you that, first of all, the Vorticons are all mind-controlled at the behest of the Grand Intellect. All of them. And then it asks you not to kill them. This carries with it two horrifying realizations. First, to proceed through the rest of the game with this knowledge requires knowing that you are killing Vorticons, helpless slaves in their own bodies. That's bad. That's a rough challenge for a game that is, at the very least, a bit unfair about how it distributes enemies and difficulty spawns right in its enormous, clunky, vertical over horizontal engine. This game isn't easy, and I haven't finished it without shooting, despite the time spent trying. The other thought is that you've already killed people? The Vorticons aren't an alien nothing. The guns you shoot on Mars aren't knocking people out. They're killing people, and the killing was done without you necessarily knowing or assuming. Though I guess there wasn't really a way to non-violently crush the Vorticon captain. The justification that they are threatening you and may kill you is perhaps compelling, and we're not going to get into the Jesper Juul side idea of how multiple lives interact with the game fiction. But even then, that's not necessary because why is this game about being an 8-year-old super scientist genius so dark of a sudden, and also all along? It's one of those things that I think is part of how Tom Hall got along in id Software early on. There is a bleakness to it, a schlockness to it, and it is pretty funny to realize this game at one point goes, hey Billy, this is part of a war, and the blood of my comrades and my friends and my family, it is on your hands, and I, in my inaction, my hands. We will never be able to be clean of this sin that we have been forced to commit against my stolen people. Anyway, there are teddy bears up in that top corner that'll get you an extra life. This is an interesting example of what structuralist game examination, the kind Gerard Genette never did, calls hypertext. Text is the work, a participation in the media, the thing in the game, the pieces of the game, the text that goes into the prompts of the game, the graphics, the sound, all of the components that you are meant to be engaging with. Then there's the paratext, the zone of media created to experience that media, which include things like interviews about the work, the box it came in, the way your room changes, your perception of the light in the game, but also the actual play, a creative experience that you are making within the boundaries of the game's rules. There's also subtext, which are things in the text implied but not stated, and supertext, things the text says that it has in common with other unrelated works, as well as metatext, the way that the text replicates trends in other related works. Then finally, we get to hypertext. Hypertext is the way a text changes when you participate in the same text multiple times. First coined when describing interactive fiction, like Twine games, hypertext is the conceptual space where video games thrive. Hypertext is how you can develop a view of a text by iterating over it again. Sometimes this means rewatching a movie with a twist ending, or watching a movie for the 30th time and seeing all the technical details in it now that you can appreciate them. Or maybe it can mean reading a book twice with a 10-year gap in between and contrasting your two opinions. Video games get to use hypertext a lot, because when it comes to a game with, say, multiple endings, it's not a question of which ending is true, because all of them are true, and players will usually play to experience all of them. Hypertextuality is using the text to examine the text. In this case, the first time I finished Commander Keen 2, I never thought about the moral implication of the shooting, because I figured the enemies were going to get back up. Some of them did, some were immune, and they were shown falling over, or bouncing and glaring, or being surprised at their state. Also, this is a boys' own adventure. There's no need to think about the morality of the violence, because the story was more focused on exploration and making that violence feel relatively low impact. You don't see blood or injury, just enemies, and they get zapped. Once you know about this other point, that the gun works, the gun kills, the gun is good, the penis is evil, and nobody you kill in Game 2 deserves it, the entire game changes. You can't not know about it. It was true whether you knew it or not, and the game has no intention of making you feel good about whether or not you engage with it. That is some pretty heavy stuff to drop on an 8-year-old. Commander Keen 3, Keen Must Die, is the capstone of the first trilogy and is meant to be a kind of finale for the character. For now. While 1 is an escape and 2 is a rescue, 3 is a weird kind of journey to confrontation, and the first real representation of something you could consider a boss monster in this otherwise runny, jumpy, looky, shooty game. It's this boss monster. The boss monster that absolutely crushes me when I get footage of it. In 3, Keen travels to the home world of the Vorticons to do battle with the Grand Intellect, who is both in charge of the invasion force and directly out to get Keen personally. To defeat the Grand Intellect, he fights his way through the normal homes and lives of the Vorticons, which have been militarized and made into defenses for the Intellect. The Intellect, who you then discover right at the end, is your rival. That guy. No way! Who you've never heard of before this point. It's Mortimer McMire, not Morty Maxwell or Montana Max. Different 90s video game villains. And that's a second Super Solvers reference, so ding! Why does Mortimer McMire want to blow up the Earth? Because everyone there sucks, and he's smarter than them. That is to say, Mortimer McMire believes that everyone in the world who doesn't test well on an IQ test, famously racist institution that they are, compared to him, deserves to die. And in that way, this game was remarkably prophetic about the state of nerd culture in 2023. Yikes. Mortimer's IQ is 315. Billy's is 314, because it's a pie reference. Mortimer, knowing that he's smarter than even the smartest other kid in the world, has resolved that that means that he can blow up the world and lose nothing of importance. Which, if nothing else, you have to respect the scope of pettiness. Structurally, 3 is Billy kind of presented as an aggressor, and it's for a strange purpose. He's on the Vorticon's home planet to try and find the person imprisoning them and liberate them. But in the process of liberating most of them, he's going to certainly kill a lot of them, including several children. The story even makes a point of it. The final narration says that you're crowned and hailed as a hero by the Vorticons you haven't slaughtered. Something you might have noticed so far is that despite being games full of levels for you to play, the narratives of each King game quietly ask you to finish the game with as little time spent in it as possible. In the first game, you're under a time crunch. You have to get your ship repaired before your parents come home. In the second game, your priority is the destruction of the guns on the ship, and you don't really care about the other things on the mothership. In the third game, you're exploring the everyday homes of the mind-controlled Vorticons, who you know definitely don't deserve to be killed. It's interesting because this kind of game is one where the fun of the game is usually in exploring and playing them. There's a reward in the form of points and, looking around, right? There are little hidden messages that you don't see if you don't explore. Pogo stick aside, you never get power-ups, you never get better. You do get lives and points and ammunition, and there's a high score table. The first time through the game, you're trying to find the end of the game. But after that point, on the second playthrough, you're left playing a game where your optimal path through the narrative is playing as few of the levels as possible. These are games that narratively invite speedruns. Oh, there is one other thing in this first trilogy. Not to do with Mortimer McMire, not any kind of villainous opponent across all 7 games, because we're not going to see more from him. Not really. He's going to show up, but it's very much, really? That guy? No. What Keen 3 gives is the first full translatable cipher of the standard galactic alphabet, which is used to decorate all the signs around the levels. When you find the secret area, it lets you finally go back and translate all the notes you've ever found written in this script. Like in Minecraft. Yeah, Minecraft's written script for the enchantments. That's from Commander Keen. Does this mean anything? Not really, no. I guess it just shows that Hatsune Miku is a fan of 90s shareware video games. Thus ends the Vorticon saga, the first 3 games of the Commander Keen series. But those are the games as game texts, as things for immediate critique that you can get into and play. The games are boxes you reach into and you move the parts around inside them. What about the box outside the box? What about the machine that made the game? The id Software that started a genre and defined an industry? Not here, but later. And where does Tom Cruise figure in? And I know, if you're a super nerd who knows the origin of Doom, you may think you know how Tom Cruise is involved. But no, it's not that. Commander Keen was a game made to solve a problem. Before Commander Keen, the PC video game market had an unsolved problem. And it was a problem that the consoles of the time, the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, could handle really easily. The question was about smooth, scrolling backgrounds in order to create a space. If you looked at video games from before Commander Keen, it's very rare on the PC to see a game where a game entity, like the player, walked forward and the screen moved with you. Instead, you were likely to see screens that split things up bit by bit or limited the movement of the player to big fixed distance steps, because what it was secretly doing was drawing simple tiles, and keeping a protagonist moving slowly was a good way to keep the buffer for making those tiles from being overwhelmed. That's how other games, like the Super Solvers, handled their ageless, faceless, gender-neutral, culturally ambiguous adventure person, waddling along through a school at a fixed rate in a slow-scrolling background in fixed distances. These fixed steps were how the game avoided trying to load too much at once. And even then, you'll notice the screen loading is a little weird and feels a bit choppy. It creates a phenomenon called tearing, where layers of the screen load differently to one another. So, scrolling backgrounds and fluid movement. It was a thing that EGA-based PC games could do, but they couldn't do it fast, and they couldn't do it fluidly, and they also couldn't do it in a way that handled changing inputs from players, which would allow for fast reactions and really dynamic play the way that the Nintendo and the Genesis could. The problem was the EGA chip, or Enhanced Graphics Adapter, which was, by the way, a lot better than its predecessor, the CGA, Color Graphics Adapter, but both were pretty ugly and limited. CGA could manage 4 colors, but EGA, it stepped up to a whole 16. VGA was years away, and the EGA was the industry standard for PC games, and what it could absolutely not do is Nintendo-style smooth scrolling. Now, I'm not going to try to give you a lesson in how the EGA chip handled these things, because I can't, and even if I tried, it would just be me copy-pasting into my script from Masters of Doom. The solution, as best I can describe it, is that they simply lied to the graphics display about what they were meant to be loading. Rather than try and load the whole level on demand at any given point, you were loading a little bit more of the level than you could see, and moving that grid of extra space around. You had one full tile on each edge. You were showing a 15 by 15 tile of square tiles, but you were loading a 17 by 17 square of them. And when you moved over one, you didn't load a never-ending thread in that direction. You were just moving the invisible tile off the edge into the visible area, unloading the ones that just left off the back, and loading into the freshly emptied space. Rather than on-demand delivery of graphics, it was a sort of just-in-time system. When it comes to this kind of ingenuity, you hear that, and I bet if you're one of my very smart graphic design friends with lots of technical knowledge and bappy wolf paws, you go, duh. But also, this was being done on a chip that could manage 8 kilobytes of graphics at a time. For comparison, the plain text Wikipedia page on kilobyte is 227 kilobytes. The plain text of this script is, at the point of 6,000 of the 9,000 words it wound up being, 30 kilobytes. 8 clapping emojis is about 8 kilobytes. 8 kilobytes is very small, and using a space that small to process smooth visuals, at least the first time, was very, very impressive. Commander Keen isn't the first thing they made with it. The first thing they made was Dangerous Dave in Copyright Infringement, which was a proof of concept where they made a Super Mario Bros. Level that ran fluidly and correctly on an EGA computer. This was a disc famously left on Romero's desk after Carmack spent all night making it work, and was a proof of concept that the PC could do the kinds of games they wanted to do, that they could make the things they wanted to make the way they wanted to make them. In a lot of ways, this technology is what let id Software form, going from a business in potential to people with a product. A year before Commander Keen 1 came out, the MCGA and VGA chipsets dropped, and EGA was functionally at that point a dead chipset walking. But when Commander Keen was out, it was always running on old tech. PC gaming moved slowly. People weren't going to update their video card to run one game. and making a game that ran on the computer that most people had was necessary. And thus, Commander Keen's 1 through 3 had to make it work on EGA. After the closure of the Vorticon trilogy, what next? Well, if you go through the chronology of these things, the next thing is the lost chapter of Commander Keen. Keen Dreams, released only months ahead of the next real Commander Keen game, mid-1991. Keen Dreams marked a turning point in Commander Keen design. Where the first games were about overcoming a technological impossibility, as they perceived it, Keen Dreams was a game to address a new problem: legal obligations because of misbehavior. See, Commander Keen was a success. id Software had all the money to make themselves into a proper company. They could stop working on it as a hobby while doing a day job, pulling together the early dream teams of Johns Romero and Carmack, Tom Hall, and Adrian Carmack, no relation. Together, this squad left their jobs at Softdisk Software to make a new company. Except there was a little spike in the tail, because it turns out they'd developed Commander Keen's 1 to 3 on Softdisk's computers, in their off time at work. id, considering the situation and really wanting to make their own games rather than being on the hook to keep being part of Softdisk, made a deal to settle this misuse of company machinery. The deal was that they'd make several games for the Softdisk Gamer's Edge subscription service. The deal was essentially a shareware game a month. id delivered on this, and sure, the games had a fairly healthy I guess that'll do vibe. Educational games, puzzle games, a mahjong game, things that can be made pretty easily, and the question of how well you do is a matter of polish. They weren't all walk-it-in style Friday night of the assignment games, though. There were the 2 pre-Doom first-person shooters, Hover Tank 3D and Catacomb 3D, and the very id vibes game, Dangerous Dave in the Haunted Mansion. And then there was Keen Dreams. Keen Dreams is a decent game. It's fine. It's alright. It's definitely weaker than Keen 4, and a little bit better than Keen 3. There's less game here than you'd think, less spectacle, less fun exploration. Enemies are all based on vegetables, and usually some variety of pun, or playing with words that sounded familiar. You're going to run through places that are, well, also puns or wordplays. You're going to find keys, you're going to collect flower power for flinging at baddies, and all in an attempt to defeat the villain of the story, the leader of all the vegetable kingdoms who's been kidnapping children via their dreams, Boobus Tuber. Keen Dreams is definitely a Commander Keen game. It's about Commander Keen, after all. It was the first of the VGA Keens released, but not the first made. It was essentially present. Now, the remaining 3 Keens after 4, 5, and 6 use this base engine, but they have a very different style. They continue Keen's adventures into space, while Keen Dreams is instead focused on the story of Keen being a child. The first adventures were about getting up to something exciting when left to your own devices and your parents were out at dinner, or dealing with a school bully, while Keen Dreams is about not wanting to eat your vegetables and having a nightmare about being tormented by the food you don't like. The whole game has a lot of what I think of as Tom Hallness to it. There's a really deliberate lightness to the whole thing. Tom did report that his parents weren't happy with how the Vorticons in Commanders 1 through 3 left behind corpses, because, you were killing them. In Dreams, instead, your flower power seeds that you throw at enemy vegetables, they just turn them into flowers for a little bit that are very exhausted. When you die, you don't even do the classic wiggle bounce that other Keen games make you do. You fall asleep. It is a gentle game, really. It's weird then that Keen Dreams has a failure state. The Commander Keen games are relatively robust. They're not glitch-free by any means. The first 3 games have holes in the ceiling that you can thwack up into. Dreams lets you sneak keys out of levels to use in levels out of sync. 4 has death warps, and 5 has door manipulation, and the most ridiculous thing you can do is in Keen 6. We'll get there. Still, the games are, for the most part, an engine dedicated to handle scrolling correctly. So levels are largely about just moving. Running, jumping, climbing, predicting your jumps, and your awareness of vertical or horizontal arcs. They're pretty much just simple iterations on simple objects, and there aren't a lot of things that can do things that create weird, glitchy behaviors. Plus, the way that you die to almost everything dangerous means that if you're ever stuck, the game will usually default to finding a way to kill you off, and that kicks you out of the game. You may not win, but the game doesn't lock up with nothing to do, while it deprives you of ways to advance. Also, to make the exploration more safe, Keen games tend to be designed as a sequence of levels that you can do in almost any order. That means outside of skipping the pogo in Keen 1, it's very hard to make whole levels unwinnable by dint of a choice earlier in the game. And it's not like the pogo is hard to get. In Keen Dreams, to kill Boobus Tuber, you need things called Boobus Bombs. These bombs are scattered throughout the world in sets of 3, and in a number of levels in hidden spots. You can finish the levels without getting the bombs. That presents the possibility that you can finish all the game's levels without getting enough Boobus Bombs and find yourself running around in a game world that cannot be finished. There are 7 levels with Boobus Bombs in them, which means it's possible to finish 4 of the 16 levels, and by not getting the Boobus Bombs there, meaning the game doesn't have enough Boobus Bombs in it to be winnable. It's a byproduct of freedom, and it's an example of something id games normally design around. It's a lesson that most of the subsequent Keen games avoided. It's a phenomenon that you might be familiar with in the context of Sierra games as dead man walking syndrome, where the game is bricked, but you won't know it's bricked until you've spent a lot more energy exhausting all your alternatives. Oh, and you don't have a pogo, and you can't grab ledges, which means that Keen Dreams doesn't control a lot like either the previous or subsequent games. But okay, enough faffing around with a lost chapter. The contractually obligated all just a dream Keen. What about the next place for the story to go? Commander Keen 4, Goodbye Galaxy. Billy Blaze is off cruising the galaxy again, looking for fun on the weekend, and he hears a distress call. Investigating it, he finds out there's a new threat to reality, but to understand it, he's going to need some heavy-duty information gathering, which he does by approaching the Gnostocene ancients on the planet known as the Shadowlands. Thus begins another journey of Keen to the fire level, the water level, the ice level, the hole level, to find the 8 bearded dudes and their janitor, if you're good. At its heart, the game is a treasure hunt, like Commander Keen's 1 and 2. You arrive in a top-down world where you move around between a bunch of little places of interest, and these are levels. The locations of interest can bar your way to progressing to other locations, and there are other locations that are further barred by less obvious means. For example, there are some islands you can't get to at first, and there's no obvious adjacent level to beat to work out a way to progress. There are only about 8 levels you need to finish, some levels gate other levels, where you can find the 8 Gnostic mystics that will be able to divine your needed information and win the game. Keen 4 was the chapter almost everyone I know got to play, because it was free to share, because, like I said, shareware. It was also brightly coloured, had vibrant music if you had an ad-lib or sound blaster, and it didn't feature a load of bloods or guts, the way that video games were parodied as being at the time. You weren't shooting things with a laser gun that killed them anymore. Basically, Commander Keen 4 was easy to distribute and worth distributing. No one's parents got mad. You'd use it to show off what a computer could do, and you could just straight up give someone a whole game for the cost of a disc as a present. That normally is enough to make a game a nostalgic classic, because video games in the 90s were in many cases there to be something you reused until you absolutely had wrung everything out of it. In the case of Commander Keen 4, though, it's a merciful coincidence that the game is also really quite good. An interesting question is, what are these places? If you look around the environments of Gnosticus 4, you'll find that a lot of these places are designed to reflect a space people don't necessarily live, but where they do go. Locations like Slug Village, Border Village, Hillville, and even the Perilous Pit are all clearly places people live, as you can tell by the number of doors and lodgings, even if they're not exactly fleshed out with beds and the like. They're all village-shaped, with a sort of villaginess to them. There are large forts like San Diego and probably Crystallis, places that have some purpose that implies a construction, and there are pyramids, which implies mysteries and hidden knowledge with things like runic iconography. This is of course a byproduct of tile sets and, again, the limited colour palette. Oh, you could put 256 colours on the screen now we're in VGA, but loading them and moving them around made scrolling less excellent, so you made everything out of standardized tiles that you can bolt together to get things to go faster. This is why very few levels have any unique visual elements. Sometimes you see something, but aside from Miragia, most levels look like a unique combination of elements rather than a unique element unto themselves, which is also pretty cool. Small number of parts, used well. Goodbye Galaxy is a midpoint game. It's, in a way, the kind of story you'd see as the two of a trilogy, like The Earth Explodes, rather than the start of one. Though, it and its sequel were conceived as a pair, not a trilogy. It's because what you're doing, the thing you're after primarily, is information. Billy is trying to rescue 8 grumpy old men who can commune with a really powerful artifact in a very funny way, and get Billy the information he needs about how to stop the Shikadi. If you look at video games of this period, the typical end of any given game is killing something. The plots of these games may sometimes have made that end goal, a boss monster, something that may have impeded information, or may, like in games like Biomenace, reveal to you that, hey, actually there's something else you don't know about now. Now, I'm not getting all functional determinist here. I'm not trying to argue because video games express violence that that's all they're good for, because that's incredibly dumb. But the premise of Goodbye Galaxy isn't that you're finding an artifact broken into pieces or building a weapon or awakening an evil you can kill, but instead you're trying to find people who can explain something to you. There's something to be said about the instrument the game is shaping and what matters to Billy. What I'm saying is, pay your librarians more. There's something weirdly sweet in all that too. Billy is trying to learn something, and as much as it can be metaphorized, all of this game is about a quest for discovery. Oh, sure, he still gets through it with a stun gun, but there's a question you have to answer on the way to building that collection of 8 elders. There's something weird about this because we often see the question of middle stories in trilogies as being hard to do. Like I said, in Goodbye Galaxy, they don't bother introducing or explaining the story, which they could do as their own thing, but if they had done a story introducing the conflict, then Goodbye Galaxy would be a nearly perfect example of a middle story. You know there's a problem, you don't know how to solve it, and you look for a solution that makes a game mechanical demand out of finding not the solution, but finding out how to find it out. Anyway, what I'm saying is that Commander Keen 5 is Half-Life 3. One final note about this, though. The music in Keen 4 is nothing but bangers. Commander Keen 5 is kind of the last full conclusion that Commander Keen got. Not a shareware game and arriving on the scene as the BBSs were getting to the point of being able to pirate games a bit more readily, it was apparently a real good seller. At least, according to id Software when asked about it 10 years afterwards. In 5, you've found and boarded the Shikadi's Armageddon machine, and you have to travel to all the different parts of a great big ship, again, to disable all the bits of the machine that are going to do something bad, again, until you encounter a final stage that involves doing something a tiny bit different. And that's new. It's back to exploring a location with more of Keen running, jumping, climbing, fighting. This time, instead of encountering wildlife and living creatures, he's mostly fighting against ship security and guard robots and the occasional hapless system operator that can completely mess with the game code if it touches you accidentally. By the time we reach the Armageddon machine, the game definitely has a feel of mastery to it. There are more secrets designed to play with your expectations and assumptions. Monsters are a little more time-crunched, and there's also the biggest monster in all the games, the wonderfully enormous big red robot. The levels are a bit more interwoven, a bit more easy to get lost in. Reading the tea leaves, I feel like the game is just a bit larger and made by people more familiar with the tools they were using, but also, I might just be getting that vibe because I'm less familiar with it. Where Goodbye Galaxy was populated by monsters that were meant to be the native wildlife and weirdo beasts of the Shadowlands, the Armageddon machine is a spaceship, set up and set aside from its environment. Everything in it is something that's meant to be there, things with a purpose and a reason to be where they are, because someone chose to make them that way. Because someone human, is guiding these monsters. That's right, once more it's the revelation that the story of Commander Keen episodes 4 and 5 is about Mortimer McMire, and you can tell because they say so. But yeah, monsters in Armageddon Machine are more directly and deliberately malicious and a lot less whimsical. There's no slugs that poop, or charming, friendly, bouncy balls, or even just things you can point at and see as creatures just living their lives. They don't creech. There's even more mechanical, more purpose to the game's creatures and its setting. But while Shoxons may be cute, there's something so much more charming about Goodbye Galaxy's monsters. Or maybe I just really like the sneaky rocks. And then finally, we reach the last game in the Keen heptalogy, Aliens Ate My Babysitter. Gosh, I think this is a nice game to look at. Maybe that's just me. Keen 6 is set on the world of Fribulous Zax, where Billy's babysitter has been kidnapped too. It means you get a mix of all the beautiful outdoor environments of the style of Goodbye Galaxy, but along with that, you also get the wonky, weird factories and the buildings the Bloogs have as they emulate what is definitely human society. There's a really fun, charming aesthetic here that feels, again, to me, very Tom Hall, where there's an inherent comedy in a world full of extremely stupid sci-fi super tech versions of things we're familiar with. There's a style to it all. There are more silly words. Things like how you're not breaking fuses to destroy an elaborate machine, you are getting the second biggest sandwich you've ever seen to get through a gate. The Bloogs have factories, but they run around in them butt naked, smacking the ground with big clubs. There are chicken people running at high speed, carrying keys around, and you've got to knock them out to get the keys to advance the game. There is a goofiness to the kinds of things you see in this environment, even the things that are meant to be menacing. I love Keen 6. It also has one of the most ambitious endgames of all the Keen games, with the final level being essentially a maze that's explicitly trying to play with your memory and your perceptions. And I know, if you know me, you might have heard me use the phrase, "Oh, it's a fucking maze," when describing the end of 90s video games and how much I hate that. But in the case of 6, they do a really interesting job with it. It's about indulging in an aesthetic and playing with your memory, the player's memory. You can take notes and everything makes more sense. It's all a very 1990s way of looking, in the odd color scheme, the wonky architecture, the intestine walls and high-tech flaming orbs side by side. Commander Keen 6 Aliens Ate My Babysitter is also the most broken of the Keen games, with a bug that you would never discover if you weren't actively trying to push glitches in speedrun tests. You see, somehow, the bullets in your stun gun, they're objects. So if you execute a particular technique right, Keen stands on the bullet as he shoots it, which launches you in a straight vertical line through most of the level. Given how many of these levels are extremely vertical puzzles, like towers to climb, it can make Keen 6 one of the most shocking games to watch in speedruns. Shout out to Captain Clever for teaching me that trick, by the way. Keen 6 ended with a promise of a final confrontation with Sir not appearing in most of these games, Mortimer McMire. The final confrontation never happened, for perhaps obvious reasons. There were no other Keen games. The license for Keen doesn't really belong to id anymore, and the people who made the first games all moved on to another stage of their lives, and to other projects. I like talking about Keen in light of Doom, because Doom is so significant and important, but also because it's got this mix of adolescence and self-seriousness. It's a game with murder and blood and demons and rocket launchers and chainsaws, and it doesn't feel like the follow-up game to a bunch of games about collecting teddy bears on Mars. It's very easy to look at the gap in aesthetics between Commander Keen and Doom and Quake and ask, what happened? Did they lose something that made this kind of game not work anymore? And yeah, they did. They lost Tom Hall. Tom Hall was the fiction and lore guy, the storyteller and other stuff, I don't mean to imply he just wrote documents all day, of the early id days. Famously, he didn't have a lot to do on Doom, and all the work he did on Quake was scrapped. And if you want to know what that work was like, you can find it in the info for Commander Keen, where that game describes the ambitious story of a future game, of the game they wanted to make, far off when you play a hammer-swinging demigod called Quake. I don't mean to just retell Tom Hall's story. Hall moved on, after id, to work on games like Rise of the Triad and Terminal Velocity, both great games on their own terms. Anachronax, which was, at the very least, an interesting game. It even fails to deliver on its plot and assumes it'll get a sequel, in the true Commander Keen tradition. Nowadays, if you look him up on social media, he's mostly spending his time playing with games, offering advice to other developers, and doing weird experiments like a game whose whole codebase can fit inside 2 standardized toots. He's not embarrassing himself by talking about chromosomes in sport. Tom Hall is responsible for the design of the Dopefish. He's responsible for Commander Keen, along with others, of course. It might suck to have his story have this wrinkle where id Software pushed him out because they didn't need him, because he was too busy having fun and coming up with cool ideas that people might like. But also, I suspect he's pretty fine now. Okay, that's Minecraft, Tom Hall. And is there anything I'm forgetting? Oh yeah, there is. Tom Cruise. Of course. What are you thinking, relates to Tom Cruise in this project? If you're a particular kind of nerd, you might be thinking about how Tom Cruise is the guy who's responsible for naming Doom, based on this clip from The Color of Money. But no, that's about Doom. That's not about Commander Keen. The traditional way to talk about id Software is about its genesis. There's usually the vision of the company as being at its heart, the intersection of the work between John Carmack and John Romero, usually as seen as being 2 guys in their early 20s after major life changes, given the freedom and space to work with one another. But did you ever wonder how they met? They met because they were both recruited to make video games by a guy called Jay Wilbur. Jay was the guy recruited by Softdisk to make video games for them, and he recruited Carmack and Romero, seeing a programmer and a game creator who both had the minds to work on the kinds of project he wanted them to make at Softdisk. And Jay Wilbur, who is now the vice president of business at Epic Games, before he worked for Softdisk, he was a bartender. And he was the guy who taught Tom Cruise how to do mixing drinks in this showy theatrical way in the movie Cocktail. There, I think I got most of the things you'd find if you just read the book Masters of Doom by David Kushner. This video was a product of months of work, if you can call writing like this that kind of work. It was originally meant to be a thing a lot like the text and video work I did for the Super Solvers, with multiple text articles going up showing the development of the script in stages, then finally one video going up that showed you the whole thing brought together. But the schedule for this year didn't work out, and I had the time to do this, so I wound up doing it this way instead. Here, have one 8,000 word article and an hour-long video about Commander Keen to go with it. And hey, if you're the kind of person who likes my productive work, my writing, my podcasting, my video making, and you think, I like it, but I wish there was more of it, well, here is more of it. I hope you like it. If you don't like it, please tell me how and why, and what I can do to make it better. And if you think that this kind of long-form media is bad, and you're not here for it, you'd rather a 7-minute quick dive on, say, Gerard Jeanette again, I'd be happy to talk to you about that too. What I'm saying is, please give me feedback. I crave attention. And of course, this was all made with the support of my patrons over on Patreon. And I thank you all so very much for that.